Hello, everyone. This is Karim Harji. Welcome to the webinar on impact measurement and the SDGs. Thank you for joining us this morning or evening, depending on where you are. We've had a lot of interest from all over the world. We have over 600 people registered from 70 plus countries. So glad to see many of you here. We will have people join us shortly. So just like to welcome you. We're pleased to see the high interest in the topic, and certainly there's a lot happening around the Sustainable Development Goals, but we're only just getting started around impact measurement. And so on today's webinar, we'll talk a little bit about framing some of the issues around impact measurement, provide some examples, and take your questions. So for those of you that have questions throughout the webinar, you can submit them through the chat box, and we will look forward to hearing from you. So we define impact measurement as long-term significant changes, both positive and negative, intended and unintended. And obviously, many different groups define impact quite differently. So the SDGs provide a lot of different ways to situate this question of impact. What impact are we talking about? From whom? How do we know? And there are multiple types of organizations that are working on these issues. Governments, the UN, investors, corporations, networks, including many of you that are participating on this webinar. However, the practice of impact measurement is still quite fragmented. So today we'll have two speakers who will provide examples of frameworks and their applications to impact investing, both to portfolios and funds, as well as to social enterprises and corporations. They can also speak to the application of many of these concepts to development projects, as well as more generally civil society. So I'll begin with some overall framing remarks for the webinar. We'll have our two speakers then talk about their respective initiatives and themes, and then we'll have some Q&A with all of you. This webinar will be recorded, and the link will be sent to all of you next week. So for those of you that want to refer back to it or have any unanswered questions, it'll be available, and we'll be providing some opportunities for you to engage with us. So on the next slide, let me introduce our speakers. We have, just on the previous slide, Paula Pelaez, who's the head of Business Call to Action at the UNDP. She leads their work there, working closely with partners and member companies across a range of sectors and organizations. She'll talk more about the organization shortly. She brings 14 years of sustainable development experience, previously with Business for Social Responsibility, advising large corporations on a variety of sustainability issues, including responsible sourcing, human rights, and inclusive economies. She's worked with UNDP on private sector development, gender and youth employment, and previously also worked with a range of international NGOs, such as CARE International and the Aga Khan Foundation, on impact investing, microfinance, and value chain projects. Karl Richter is a former head of research and knowledge at the UN SDG Impact Finance Initiatives, where he was responsible for leading its work on impact management, which you'll hear more about shortly. He brings over 10 years of experience working with social entrepreneurs and investors in this area around impact measurement and management, and as the co-founder of EngagedX, was one of the first globally to publish benchmark data on impact investing. He's previously also worked with the OECD around data standards, and has recently returned to the private sector, but continues to collaborate closely with UNDP. So both Paula and Karl bring a wealth of experience in this area, and particularly with their roles within the UNDP, can share some of the broader framing around the SDGs. So on the next slide, for those of you that have joined us as part of previous webinars, you'll know that this is being hosted by the Oxford Impact Measurement Program, a new executive education program that's going to be hosted in July this year. We bring a range of speakers from the public, private, and civil society sectors, including some of the logos that you see here. Both Paula and Karl will be participating, and they will be giving you a bit of a preview around some of the topics they will be discussing in the program. And the program is really intended to provide the tools, frameworks, and perspectives around how to navigate impact measurement and impact management. And you can learn more about the program at the link here. And certainly, if you want to look at our previous webinars, including the last one on lean data and impact management, you can visit our site. For those of you that have been part of this webinar series before, you'll know that this is part of a broader portfolio on the next slide of programs that we have at the Said Business School at Oxford, including impact investing, social finance, and impact measurement. So that's just on the next slide if we flip shortly. And now I want to talk a little bit about framing this topic, just for those of you that are a bit new. So on the next slide, we've provided some snapshots of some reports and some resources. And I just want to highlight a couple of things. Often when we talk about measurement, we're talking about a variety of different approaches. On this webinar, we're only going to focus on a subset of them. But more broadly, sometimes we talk about looking at country level strategies and how governments can play a role in tracking and monitoring progress. We also want to understand at the aggregate level, are we actually going to meet the SDGs? Are we going to meet the targets? We also talk about trying to build the capacity of organizations, networks, and individuals to collect, use, and verify SDG-related data. So there's a lot of different ways when we talk about measurement and evaluation. And today you'll hear about one subset of those, especially as it relates to the role of the private sector. Now, this is one new aspect from the MDGs, where there's much more emphasis on the private sector around their engagement, and this includes both corporations, large and small, as well as inclusive businesses and social enterprises. Impact investors have also been increasingly interested in this area and are trying to align their portfolios and investments with the SDGs, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And in many cases, there are still some unanswered questions and challenges, and so in this webinar today, we're just going to frame some of them with you and how we are resolving them. On the next slide, this is typically how we tend to think about what alignment with the SDG means. We look at the kinds of activities that we do. We try and look at the outputs and outcomes, and then we try and link them to one or more SDGs. In practice, given that the SDGs are universal, and often any type of program, intervention, enterprise that typically works on not just a single SDGs, but also influences other SDGs. And as you can see from this graphic, even if you're providing clean water through new access points, the long-term outcomes tend to focus around health, school attendance, increased safety and security, and so in that way, they intersect with multiple SDGs. So when we think about some of the unresolved challenges and questions, just broadly around measurement, in my opinion, there are at least three of them. The first is, what does alignment really mean, and how do we go beyond alignment? So in many ways, it's fairly straightforward to identify your primary SDGs that you work around. But what happens when there are multiple SDGs that are related? How do we look at target setting versus indicators? And what do we mean when we talk about contribution to targets? So that's one set of issues. Second set of issues is around who defines what gets measured and how do we look at contribution? So we have the targets and goals as starting points, but as we know, impact includes both positive and negative elements. And there's also the role of external verification and accountability. So there are a whole set of questions around who is doing the measuring and what do we try and mean around what gets measured. And the third is, how do we move from measuring and reporting to really changing behaviors? A lot of the focus right now has been around better data collection and better reporting, but there's a whole set of issues around how to think about what's most material or significant or relevant to the needs of communities and different groups. And so we won't talk about all of these issues. We're just bringing them up because these are the broader context within which impact measurement is situated. And certainly these are topics both within the program and hopefully on future webinars we'll be able to pick up. So if you have any questions for us on any of these areas, please flag them and we can consider future webinars on some of these topics. Finally, by way of context, I do want to say that for this topic is new for many of you, and we've seen that from who's been registering. In the next few slides, we've provided a set of resources for you to refer to. I won't be talking about them in any great detail. We will have the presentation posted online, so you will have access to all of these links, but this is simply for your reference, and then we'll get to Karl's presentation shortly. So if I go to the next slide, these are just some examples from the world of impact investing. We have some frameworks around how to align with the SDGs. We have some guidance. We've got initiatives like the Impact Management Project that are trying to look at different dimensions and how they relate to the SDGs. And the last link from the UNPRI has a really great set of links and resources and initiatives that they've listed on that page. So I would encourage you to look at that on your own time. On the next slide, many impact investors are thinking about thematic strategies. So if they operate in agriculture, there's obviously a link to sustainable food related issues, but also generally around health, etc. There are some additional resources on this link below around how impact investors are looking at evaluating impact investing. And finally, many of you are also on the next slide thinking about standards. How do the SDGs relate to the existing standards in impact measurement, in blended finance, in social enterprise? And CINSR has a really great tool where you can click on the SDG targets, and they provide links and relationships to other taxonomies like IRIS and GEARS. So that hopefully is a good resource for some of you. Next slide is a few resources on inclusive business. Paula will obviously talk about Business Call to Action and their work. They have a set of great resources on their website. There are a few others listed here that would be helpful to you. And on the next slide, there is increasing interest in the idea of corporate venturing and the SDGs. So many different types of corporations are thinking about key questions around how they relate to or contribute to the SDGs. This is a new initiative through the business school, and again, the link is at the bottom of the page. So with all that, hopefully some of those were useful. I'm now going to pass it over to Karl to tell us a little bit more about his work within UNSIF and framing impact measurement at UNDP. So Karl, over to you.
Thank you, Karim, and good day to everyone. I'd like to start with this slide. As Karim mentioned, the Sustainable Development Goals have started to take a very strong focus in orientating people's thinking around the impact management agenda. And this is an agenda that's running until 2030. It's a 15-year program set out by the United Nations. And as Karim alluded to in the opening, these goals are universal and they are integrated, which means that they are applied to all countries and also across private and public sector. What I'd like to do is focus on the structure, just to set the scene. And we've got, at the high level, we've got 17 goals, and for each of those goals, there are roughly 10 targets, and each of those targets have a number of indicators attached to them, roughly about 2 or so. And I've brought up 2 examples, and the reason I wanted to bring them up was simply to point out that not all the goals and targets relate to everyone. For example, if you look at the one at the top, that's much more suited to the private sector in terms of rolling out automated cash machines, whereas the one at the bottom is very much more focused on urban and regional planning policies. So very much public sector. At the UN, and particularly the UNDP, we've been involved with impact measurement and evaluation for quite a while, and it's been particularly focused in the international aid and development finance arena. There's lots of very detailed process maps and guidance that is out there. A lot of the time, it's required some very detailed and expert people to undertake that impact management, and often the need to bring in expert consultants. Alongside that, there's been a real upsurge in recent years in terms of private sector engagement, and particularly the shift from just looking at what we're measuring towards really deeply understanding why it's important to measure impact. And in doing so, shift from more of a compliance perspective towards integrating impact management as an integral driver of success in organizations. We've at UNSIF, we've been involved with supporting the establishment of impact funds around the world. And in doing so, one of the key things that we've been asked to do is to drive the impact management agenda in terms of setting up those funds and embedding impact management principles and best practice into how those are structured. And what we've been doing in terms of our work is been initially developing a conceptual framework and the beginning of a practical toolkit with a view to creating assisted workflows and harnessing technology to help people manage their own processes as they're trying to understand their impact. And what we've been trying to do is help people get on a journey from articulating their intents towards selecting the appropriate indicators that they need and making sure that those are aligned with the SDGs and their core purpose. And one of the things that struck me in quite a few meetings that I had with UN colleagues is what we needed to do was really build and deliver something that was very practical, that provided toolkits that people could use in the field, whether it be by project managers or country office folk. And there was a definite need to move beyond the esoteric and philosophical conversations which were driving the thought leadership in the arena towards very, very practical tools. And the other context that was very important was how do we introduce tools that are then embed the principles of UNDP best practice, but target those on market-based practitioners and particularly also in the context of impact investing. So what we've done is we've developed a proof of concept, and we'll be talking about that later on. But before I talk about that, I want to introduce two key components of that. And the one is looking at the impact management journey, which is effectively a process, but we use the term journey because it's a little bit more flexible and one can make a journey in a number of different ways. And when it comes to impact management, I think it's a very personal experience for many people, and they need to have that flexibility. And the other is to look at the different typologies and the different levels of intensity with which one might engage the methodological processes, and that really gives one an orientation around the different pathways that are possible. So in the first instance, I'd like to focus a little bit on the process, on the journey. And as a reminder, I've put up the Deming quality management cycle, which for those who are familiar with business management, it's a reasonably familiar guiding framework. It's often described as a cycle, in other words, a feedback loop where the final actions inform the planning of the next phase. And what we did is we mapped and we looked at how impact management and impact measurement has been defined and documented, and we identified these 7 key stages of the process. And although some people might refer to them as fewer stages, you know, it's the same broad process that needs to be executed. And very importantly, again, it's looking at that feedback loop in terms of how the action at the end of the process then informs the decision making that looks to drive continuous improvement. We also mapped that common journey against a number of different industry processes, and I'm highlighting 2 today that are relevant for the discussion today. The one is the UNDP process, which I touched on earlier in my discussion, and the second is looking at the typical process for private sector and over-the-counter investment transactions. And the simple point to be made here is that you know, the impact management process is not an entirely foreign process, but rather can be added to every stage of existing industry processes. In the next slide, I'd like to introduce the idea of typologies and looking at different ways of aligning the intent and process. And what we've got here is we've got a spectrum with, on the left-hand side, a cluster of pathways where there's less intensity around the impact management methodology. And as one progresses to the right-hand side of the slide, one is looking at greater levels of intensity and greater requirements for depth of methodology and process. And one thing that we observed was in the middle of the slide, you'll see there's a globe, a logo of a globe, and we realized that up until a certain point, it's often a matter of understanding the facts on the ground, and then as soon as one looks at introducing the idea of a theory of change and understanding the causal relationships between the inputs and the activities and the outputs and how those relate to outcomes, it became clear that there could be many different interpretations of those facts on the ground depending on one's worldview, and that's important and something that we need to take note of and also incorporate in the process. In the next slide, I've summarized the two axes together and conceptually try to show how that process evolves in complexity and methodological intensity. But the one very important point I'd like to make on this slide is that there is no hierarchy from left to right. In other words, it's more important to identify the impact management pathway that is appropriate for the particular organization or the particular situation, and also the mandate that one has. Although having said that, it's also been helpful for some parties to first of all identify where they are according to the spectrum, and then look at where they want to be, and in so doing help design a change management program to improve their processes. In this next slide, I want to introduce the proof of concept that we've developed for an assisted workflow, and I want to stress this is very much a proof of concept. This is an example we developed in Excel, and explicitly with a view that it would inform our thinking of what our expectations and requirements would be for software provision. So it's very much a tool to communicate those ideas. But in summary, what we have is a workflow that goes from left to right. We start out with looking at intentions and how those intentions can be described, and how they in turn then can be evolved into themes and ultimately goals and indicators to build up the impact management strategy. This is an example from where we were working with some public-private partnership colleagues, and they were designing and defining what was important for them. The next stage is looking at how we then translate those self-authored intentions into some sort of structured list. And what we've got here is to show that there are a number of different organizations out there who've been doing a lot of work. Karim highlighted many of them in the beginning of the talk, and they've started to put some thinking towards first of all mapping out what impact themes are relevant for them and their networks and their constituencies, and with that comes an inherent bias, and I think that's also quite a good thing. In other words, it allows people to orientate themselves in a way that is consistent with their peers. And what we have here is the ability to create drop-down menus and be able to identify and pick and choose existing themes that other people have thought about, and therefore there will be guidance and structure in how we can use them. And what I've tried to explain here is that by encouraging people to share their thinking in terms of how they're thinking about impact themes and how they're thinking about the interrelationship of those themes and how they flow into goals and indicators, that by sharing that information in a machine readable way, it's possible for other people, and particularly software developers, to get access to those mapping tables and make that available in turn to their clients and other audiences. What we then did is we looked at how those themes map to specific sustainable development goals with the opportunity of tailoring and tweaking. And finally, looking at how once we had identified a sustainable development goal or one or two sustainable development goals that are relevant, how we could then use that to filter the broad array of indicators that are out there and create a subset and a relevant subset of indicators that would be appropriate to that particular theme and that particular intent. And in this case, I've got an example of some of the indicators from the Generis taxonomy. Finally, we were playing around with developing a search engine, and I know others in the field are doing this. I think SOCAP in the US are doing this as well. So this is very much in keeping with the zeitgeist of where both the industry is going and also what the software development community is trying to achieve as well. Perhaps before I move on to that slide, I will also summarize and say that you'll see the background there is yellow, and if you remember back to the previous spectrum, which had the different colors, yellow was roughly in the middle and was related to the sense of identifying output indicators, and it was basically a median in terms of the impact management methodology, and so we selected that as the basis for this work. Finally, we've been documenting that up in a little bit more detail, and what we've been trying to do is to identify the sub-processes that relate to each of the impact management pathways that run vertically, the different colored stripes, and trying to do that in a way that can work in a number of different ways. So the first is to look at how that can serve the community as effectively a quality assurance checklist to be able to help with quality control and make sure that we can, in terms of our own internal management processes, make sure that we are following appropriate impact management processes. The second, as I've been focusing on in the last few slides, is to look at how we can then use that definition of processes and sub-process to inform functional requirements for software developers so that they can make sure that the software they're developing meets those requirements and can take people on a journey from the beginning to the end, and not just focusing on one or two areas that might be of interest or relevant, but really give people a journey, a cradle-to-grave journey, and be able to structure that within logical pathways that meet their requirements. In a little bit more detail, but nevertheless relevant, we found that this rubric was also useful in informing how we wanted to design data architectures and ultimately data interoperability and improving reporting rigor. And finally, we've also noticed that a lot of the time people might have different areas of focus or recognize that they would have different strengths. So for example, they might identify that they could offer quite a lot towards one or two sustainable development goals, that what they're doing intrinsically and fundamentally supports and can help underpin that goal. They might secondarily have nominal contributions or impacts on some of the other goals, and then they need to be monitored and managed, but perhaps with a lesser rigor. And finally, there might be some risk management that's needed. In other words, light touch management to make sure that there's no harm being created. So in that context, we found it very helpful to help people prioritize how they allocate resources. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to Karim again.
Thanks, Karl. So as you will have seen, Karl walked through the different components around how to build a structure and a workflow to take intentions and alignment and really translate them into practice. And I'm going to just briefly show, as part of some of the follow-on work, based on the work that Karl and his colleagues have done, and also building on Karl's previous experience around data standards, as part of another initiative that I'm involved in called Venture for Good, as well as Possibility Ventures, really took this typology and tried to translate that into a set of criteria around how an impact fund would actually be able to screen ventures based on their proposed intentionality around meeting specific SDG goals and targets, how clear they are, and there are a few other dimensions. So we actually took the impact pathways that Karl described and built it out into a more elaborate typology that could be applied at the impact fund level. And just on the next slide, this gives you an example of some of the issues that Karl was referring to around how do you make these kinds of workflows machine readable? How do you organize them in a way that really provides a level of granularity when we think about what alignment really means? So in this case, we have different elements of alignment, including where ventures within an impact fund may be aligning in practice or have the potential to, where there might be some negative implications on an SDG, for example, or where a venture may be exhibiting some leadership. And so this begins to provide a level of differentiation beyond the standard high-level alignment with SDGs to really breaking out the types of nuances that are really important in terms of how investments and programs are able to apply the SDGs in terms of monitoring and evaluation and impact measurement to their work. So if you're interested to learn more, there's much more on ventureforgood.org. So please visit there and certainly let us know if you've got any questions. With that, we're going to switch gears and talk about the business perspective. So how do corporations and social enterprises think about impact measurement as it relates to the SDGs? So now I'll hand it over to Paula to talk a little bit about her work at Business Call to Action and walk us through a couple of case studies. Paula, over to you.
Thank you, Karim, and thank you, Karl. So if we start with the next slide, yeah. So as Karim was saying, I lead an initiative which is hosted by UNDP, and it's called the Business Call to Action. It is a global inclusive business platform, which it's dedicated to supporting companies to uptake and to implement inclusive business as a very concrete way in which companies support the SDGs. And we do that by working on three key pillars. The first one is, of course, access to a global network and a community of practice, as well as recognition for the work that companies are doing. We increasingly support companies to drive their impact and scale inclusive business, and that's very much in relation to what we're going to talk about today. But also leveraging our UNDP hat, we do quite a bit of work on advocacy, trying to make sure that there's a more inclusive or better, a more favorable ecosystem for inclusive business. To date, we have over 200 companies, and just to give you an idea, it's a very diverse set of companies across sizes, as you can see here, operating inclusive businesses in over 68 countries and across sectors. What they have in common is inclusive business initiatives or models that, as an aggregate to date, are expected to benefit more than 200 million people by 2030. The focus on inclusive business, we define it as those business models that are benefiting low-income communities by incorporating them in the core business activities, be it as consumers, producers, entrepreneurs, suppliers, shareholders, employers, and so on. So in the next slide, what we see here is that what we're noticing is that because of the SDGs, since the launch of the SDGs, many companies and many different stakeholders are increasingly interested in measuring their impact and their contribution to the SDGs. There are various reasons for that. If you think about business, for instance, they're interested to inform their operations, to better articulate their progress to these development objectives, to inform their strategies. If you think about investors, they're trying to inform their investment decisions as well, especially impact investors, but increasingly mainstream investors as well. If you think about governments, they are interested in understanding the contribution of the private sector to the SDGs, but also understanding how they can perhaps identify business models that are very impactful, which could be further supported with the right policy support or the right instruments. So in the next slide, What we see here, if you look at the bottom, is this graph that shows this aggregated expected impact of our member companies towards the SDGs, right? And we have this in part because when companies apply to become members of BCtA, we do help them and we support them in understanding how they are contributing to the SDGs based on their business models and their targets that they mention. However, we did notice that every year companies are expected to report on the progress that they have towards these inclusive commitments. And frankly, we were noticing that there were still gaps in that understanding or in that capacity or in the quality of data that we were receiving. So based on the trend that I was mentioning in the previous slide and based on these, we decided about 2.5 years ago, about 2 years ago, to launch a more concrete service line on supporting our members in how to measure and manage their impact, pretty much embracing the SDGs. One of the first things that we embarked ourselves to do was engage with the companies and understand, whether they were interested in such a service offer, but also if they did impact measurement, why would they do it, right? And the key buckets were they really wanted to communicate their progress, they wanted to inform their strategy driven by the SDGs, and they also wanted to identify better indicators that would help them deepen and expand their impact. But when we asked them, how they were doing that, if this was so strategic, when it comes to impact, most of them were really doing just ad hoc exercises that would happen every 5 years or so with big partnerships, right? But they weren't really creating a practice out of these. They were not doing these regularly and checking on it and improving on it. So these were all findings, but also drivers for us to embark on these. So in the next slide, we show our approach to impact management. As I said, our goal here was to challenge more inclusive businesses to adopt these impact measurement practices to encapsulate that, right? Better planning, better monitoring, and better delivering on the business value, on the impact that they had on the SDGs. And if relating back to Karl's journey or impact, the common journey, we summarized it in 4 steps, but pretty much encompasses these 7 steps Karl was mentioning, right? But the first one really speaks to that typology that he was saying, right? So the first step that we do take is assessing the readiness, understanding that companies have different motivations, but they also have different capacities, right? So they may not all be ready to embark in a very rigorous and very sophisticated impact measurement exercise. But it doesn't mean that they don't have to plan for it and understand what their expected impact should be. So in line with this journey that Karl was mentioning, we do try to offer companies an idea of the spectrum of ways in which they can approach impact measurement. The other modules are a bit more standard in different degrees depending on that capacity, but the second one is around planning and designing. So it really is, and this is where we spend quite a bit of time with the companies in helping them create what we call the impact value chain, right? And it really takes the SDGs as a starting point, and it helps companies look at that causality. Again, Karl was mentioning it, and so was Karim, on their inputs and outcomes and outputs and their desired impact. But then also understand which are those SDGs or those areas of impact where they want to focus the most their impact measurement on, right? There are many important areas that they still have to do to deliver on their model, but those may not be the ones where they want to focus the most attention on measuring and collecting data. The third one is around this monitoring of impact. So it really looks at existing data that the company may already have, at gaps in data, collection of that data, engaging internal and external stakeholders. And then, of course, the fourth step is around analyzing and reporting on that impact data. The next slide. Sorry. I wanted to share a little bit of that journey and what that journey has been for us so far. So to test that approach, we launched a service line with our companies, with 21 companies, and we wanted to be representative of the diversity of our membership. So these were a mix of companies in those sectors that are mentioned here in the slides, but also multinationals, large companies, and social enterprises in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. We did this with two partners, Artify in India and EcoMobile in Kenya, who have software that helps companies collect and visualize data very, very easily, but also quite experienced on this topic. And what we did together was a very hands-on, one-on-one support with the companies that included workshops with the companies, with senior staff and with field staff to develop this SDG impact framework and understand why they wanted to measure impact and what were the key decision-making questions. So really trying to ensure that there was clarity from the companies as to what they wanted to find out from collecting and analyzing the data. We then helped them in the development of surveys and testing them. We did include the Progress Out of Poverty Index because we wanted to make sure companies could validate that they were truly engaging, for the most part, individuals at the base of the economic pyramid. And then finally, we did work with them to analyze that data and the implications for them and how they could incorporate it in decision making. So with all of that all together was a journey that took about 1 year with all the companies. We did case studies which are referenced here in later slides. We extracted a lot of lessons. It helped us validate our approach and make some tweaks. But even more importantly, we were able to then form a working group as we were trying to design a service offer that could allow us to reach all of our members and any other companies, not really one at a time, both for cost reasons, but for effectiveness reasons as well. So all of these organizations, the logos that are listed here, they participated and they gave us incredible feedback, which then resulted, or it's a continuous effort, but in February we did launch the beta version of an online impact lab. And this impact lab, just to give you a sense of how we were able to incorporate all these feedbacks, of course it takes the SDGs as a starting point, but it makes sure that it takes not only a perspective on positive impact on the SDGs, which was, to be frank, an initial approach that we were taking, but rather a balanced approach and really looking at those areas where potential negative impact had to be minimized and positive impact could be maximized. It also embraced, as Karim and Karl have mentioned, these impact management project dimensions. And for us, this was critical because it really helped in that materiality assessment that I was mentioning for companies to decide where they should focus their impact measurement efforts the most in terms of those SDGs that were the most relevant for the business and for the impact that they desired. And then we just walk through the rest of the modules that I was mentioning. But once again, linking back to Karl's point, we did create it in a way that companies can select SDG indicators at any level of the value chain in terms, depending on what they're choosing to measure. But they can also start to see, and we will be able to analyze the convergence of which companies, depending on sector and depending on SDGs where they have their areas of impact, which are the most used indicators of companies. And the ones that we've uploaded right now include the IRIS indicators as well as relevant SDG targets, and some BCtA specific indicators that we felt there was a gap for. But the process is very, very customized for companies, but the idea is for us to be able to find points of convergence and points of divergence as well, and share that more broadly. It's an open public good, so it's free to use for all companies. At the moment, module 1 and 2, so up to the development of the value chain, are live, and in the next few weeks we will be launching the other 2 modules on the data collection and the analysis. On the next slide, what I will do is share with you an example to bring this all to life. I will focus more on the second example, and I'll go through this one a little bit more quickly, just in the interest of time. But this specific case study is with Mahindra, which provides affordable rural. It's in the affordable rural housing sector. They provide loans to rural households, and the company really wanted to better understand how their customers were perceiving the impact of the loans that they were having, beyond, of course, the obvious reason of getting access to financial services. And they had identified through the process that we did with them these 5 SDGs that we mentioned here around no poverty, good health, gender equality, better sanitation and infrastructure. And what was interesting as they embarked on all these social value chain, but also the surveys and the data collection, there were 2 key findings that were very interesting. The first one was, even though they can have an impact on SDG 5, right now women are not part of the title, of the property title of the properties that they're helping finance. So that's definitely an area and a gap where they can do more. And the second one is that even though they were assuming that they were having an impact on SDG 6, most of the customers were not investing their loans on water and sanitation facilities. So this is something that they use to improve their marketing with their customers, in using both the positive perceptions on improved property value and so on, but also in ways in which they can drive these other SDGs, which are part of their mission as well. The second example, very, very briefly, is on Access Afia, and also to show how these are different companies of different sizes. On the next slide. And Access Afia is a social enterprise that they have microclinics. They operate microclinics in Kenya, in the slums of Nairobi. They do outpatient services in these clinics, but they also have pharmacies, and they have schools programs, healthy schools programs in the surrounding communities. And once again, the company had identified these SDG 2, 3, 4, and 6 as part of their key SDGs in their value chain. And they embarked in a process of first understanding if their patients were happy and they were truly seeing impact based on the services of the clinic. But they also focused their impact efforts, or these collecting data efforts, to choose where they should expand their operations in terms of where they should put their next clinics, seeking to maximize the impact in the coming years. And the results were, again, very interesting. One, they were able to validate that indeed at least 50% of their customers were living on less than $1 a day. They validated that in terms of the sites that they had picked, the healthcare was really not good in quality and was very expensive. And based on all of these data, they were able to choose the sites for the next 3 clinics. But in terms of the SDGs, they also found that the majority of they also found that they could make a lot of improvements in terms of more specific support on these SDGs, right? And specifically with women, many of their customers are women, and yet if you look at it, they never mention SDG 5 as an example. In terms of the quality and the hunger, they realized that they could do much more work in terms of baseline and tracking and comparing efforts in their health schools program in order to demonstrate the impact much better. So these are just examples to show you how companies very concretely use these efforts. And as you can see, it's really much less about accountability and disclosure, and it is much more around driving value, engaging with the SDGs very strongly. In the next slide, I talk about some of the key learnings that we had. I'm not going to go through them, but it really captures this idea that companies have different motivations and different capacities. The success factors really depend on buy-in and ensuring that there's a feedback loop. I will mention, however, that one of the challenges as they relate to SDGs is definitely marrying the short-term and the long-term expectations of the company. So that continues to be a challenge, and I think that that's for many. And in terms of benefits, one that stands out for us is that they felt that these really helped them develop a culture of measurement. And in fact, a recent survey showed that out of these 21 companies, at least 60% continue to measure impact regularly. So they've taken these as a management practice of what they do. And then the last slide really just summarizes how the importance of understanding the SDGs from the get-go, understanding those key principles, that they are interlinked, they're universal, and it's about leaving no one behind, and how that understanding has to come from the very first planning stage, but it has to be really embedded in all the stages, in the disaggregation of data, and in the reporting of data to make sure that you're making the best impact and engagement, and not just linking with the SDGs or retrofitting what you already do with these 17 SDGs. Karim, I'll stop here and I'll pass it on to you.
Okay, thanks, Paula. And just for everyone on the next slide, there's a list of different case studies that are available on the site, and certainly you can get in touch with Paula. Because we had limited time, Paula went very quickly through both case studies, but there are several more. And for those of you that are coming from different sectors, you will appreciate, I think, some of the lessons as well as some of the indicators and approaches that were detailed in those case studies. So we'll get to some of your questions now. For those of you that haven't had a chance to submit, you can submit your questions through the box in your chat. Let's start with a couple. I mean, we had a couple of questions around the slides, so yes, they will be available together with this recording. We had another question just around the different terms that we're using: inclusive business, sustainable business, impact investment, responsible investment. That's a much longer webinar, but for those of you that are interested, you can maybe do some searches around the different communities and why they distinguish themselves, because in some cases the intentionality around impact measurement and management is much more strongly emphasized depending on the label of either business or investment. So that's a much longer discussion, but just to say that there are important distinctions between them related to the level of impact, intentionality, and measurement. We have a question for Karl. So Karl, as a bit of a heads up, we have some questions around what are the methodologies used for data collection, anything else that you can cover around how data gets captured from different types of organizations and sectors, and how would this workflow be used for, let's say, projects that businesses could invest in. So I'll give you 30 seconds to think about that while I answer one more question that came in around your approach, which is around who is qualified to assess these effects and the typology, and how do you verify this data? So if you have any other observations on that, Karl, I think one answer for me is that even as you saw with the Possibility and Venture for Good framework, there are a number of ways in which you can triangulate data in the methodology that we adapted. We have multiple people actually making assessments, and we can actually triangulate it there. So Karl, any observations just around data collection, data verification, and its application to different kinds of data sources?
Thank you, Karim, and also to the people who raised the questions. Data capture is really a key issue, because often it's the most painful exercise, and as a result can be very expensive, and if it's not done correctly, could result in incomplete information or sometimes even erroneous information. So it's really important to get that right, and I feel for a lot of people who are struggling with the issue, and I think as another general comment, I think there's a common either fatigue or pain that is experienced around capturing impact data, whether it be frontline social enterprises or NGOs or other impact organizations, or even at the other end of the spectrum, where it might be multinationals who are capturing information around their externalities and intangible value. And as the focus on this topic increases, so does the requirement to have reports produced in different formats, and different people want different things. You might have people having to report to the FTSE for Good, or the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, or Global Compact in terms of the SDGs, and the list goes on. In terms of the actual products on the ground, I know there's a lot of development in terms of, we spoke about technology, and as part of that, looking at building in apps that can be deployed on handheld devices, that they can go into the field and really take out that survey pain and survey fatigue. So putting the data capture right there in the field, so that the data can be captured at source, preferably by the person who is delivering the intervention and creating the impact, or if not directly, then at an immediate second level. There's a lot of thinking at this stage around how we can also use the knowledge that we're gaining through a deeper understanding of impact management, in terms of trying to see how we can use machine learning and artificial intelligence and all that kind of stuff. I mention that simply because I think a lot of people are talking about it, but we also need to couch that in terms of saying, yes, the technology is attractive, but we also need to know how we want to organize and structure those data, because there's no point throwing a whole lot of technology at an undefined problem. So a lot of the current focus is looking at how do we want to organize and structure impact data, particularly looking at normalizing and standardizing impact statements and reports, and accounting for impact, and using that to then inform ultimately the data aggregation processes, structures, and processes. And I think I think maybe Karim, you wanted to come in, did you?
Yeah, just very quickly, just to follow up, and if you could provide a brief response on a couple more questions, and then, or a couple questions, and then I'll ask Paula one that's come in. So just, we had a question on whether the tool is open source and available for others to use, and also how can people get involved with some of this themselves in really looking at different types of assessments. So I don't know if you want to respond to either or both of those.
Yeah, and I'll keep them brief because we're running out of time, but the short answer is yes, it is very much an open source initiative, a public good, and a free to use initiative. Very happy to share the information. I would just stress that at the moment it is published and produced as a discussion prompt to move the industry and cajole a conversation, but all the information is free to use. But at this point, we're not yet actually developing products that people can use, but rather looking to mature and elevate the conversation, and encouraging people in terms of sharing their own data mappings and data structures, and showing what the benefit of that can be.
Okay, thanks, Karl. And the Venture for Good is one of the first examples of how we're doing that, and again, trying to open up that process to be able to have people provide input around. There was a question around how do you select the alignment and scales, and wouldn't this depend on the interpretation? And all this is true. It's because these are very early efforts at trying to go a couple of levels deeper beyond alignment. It's the start of the journey, and it does involve a level of collective input. So I think if you are interested, please follow up with us, and we can certainly share more information with you via email or via LinkedIn. Paula, a couple of questions for you. One around people wanting to learn more about an end-to-end example around impact measurement for social enterprises. I think some of that will be detailed in your case studies, and then, but certainly there's much more to say around that. But also, if you can elaborate on that, or how do we think about the firm level contribution to country targets and goals, and how does that link to national level decision making and kind of statistical data collection? I think those are probably some tougher questions. But any initial thoughts
Sure.
also around either of those, or how the UN is interacting with other actors like the World Bank and others?
Right, sure. So in terms of end-to-end examples, indeed, I think if you look at some of the case studies that we have, I've listed some, but if you go into the website, there's even more. You'll see that. But the caveat there being, again, this is not a case study of and I had impact and the end, as opposed to they're also very process oriented, and they really want to capture how companies went about it, where they had challenges, where they learned lessons, but also what they had to do after, right? And some of them, in terms of concrete results, it may just be a validation that they are, dealing with the base of the pyramid. So that being one caveat, which I think it's the whole point of a management practice and not, the other point is a very interesting point. It is one that we've tried to advance with BRI. And we partnered since a few years ago to try to understand, the needs of governments and specifically statistics office, and then contrast it with, frankly, for the most part, the voluntary nature of the reporting from corporates, right? And the tensions continue, right? Tensions continue in terms of the credibility of the data, the validity of the data, and so on. Many companies in different countries are advancing this. So in Colombia, for instance, again, together with GRI and many other partners, and the government of Colombia, for instance, we and Karim, maybe I can share with you some case study on that to share. We looked at specific indicators that the Statistics National Office said, if private sector reports on these, we would be able to then take them into account as part of the voluntary national reporting. Again, very, very interesting. But I would highlight that the biggest tension at the moment, it really is on the quality or the perceived credibility of the data.
Thank you, Paula. And I think, as Karl also mentioned, there are some efforts underway to try and move some of these issues forward. But part of it involves all of us collaborating with each other, using the frameworks and tools that work in practice, and to try and think about how to continue to improve them and make them more relevant to the different actors. So unfortunately, we are out of time. There's obviously a lot more to talk about. We had several more questions we couldn't get to, but we will try and respond to them in our follow-up. Just on the last slide, we have a bit more information. The link there, if you want any information both on the program, the impact measurement program, where we're covering some of these issues, as well as the webinar series. We had recordings there, and we'll have this recording posted up. The recording link will be sent to you via email next week. And if you do have any broader questions, please email Hannah at the business school. Her email address and contacts are there, and she can help direct you to the appropriate person. I'd like to thank our two speakers for sharing their insights and their pioneering work in this area. We really appreciate it, and thank all of you for participating and for engaging with us both through the series as well as through this webinar. We're very pleased to see the high level of interest, and we hope that we can continue this discussion with many of you. So thank you, and all the best till next time.